pick the religion that you think has the highest probability that has an infinite afterlife. And so it would privilege religions that have infinities involved over those that don't, and then also privilege religions that have a higher probability over those that have a lower probability. So the question about reincarnation is really interesting, and I think that would depend on whether you're reincarnated forever or just for some, kind of finite period of time.
Dr. Liz Jackson is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at St. Louis University. Today we'll be discussing her paper, Salvaging Pascal's Wager. Please subscribe to the channel, and I hope you enjoy our conversation. Liz Jackson, thank you for coming on the show.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yes, it is such a pleasure to have you on, and we're going to dive into the thesis of your paper, Salvaging Pascal's Wager, in a moment. But I'd love to start off by asking and laying it out for the audience. What is Pascal's wager?
Yeah, for sure. So the way I like to often explain Pascal's wager is by sort of contrasting it with maybe more traditional or even more familiar arguments for God's existence. So your listeners might have heard of arguments like the ontological argument or the cosmological argument or the fine-tuning argument that say, look, because of this feature of reality or this causal pattern we observe or the apparent design in nature, that's good evidence that God exists, right? So those arguments conclude God exists, okay? Pascal's wager, I would also say, is a broadly theistic argument, but it has a different kind of conclusion. And instead of saying this is evidence that God exists, the conclusion is that you ought to believe in God, but not because of giving you evidence for God's existence, but because of sort of a cost-benefit analysis. So that's sort of the general goal of the argument and how it contrasts. And I will say some people have this misconception that it's supposed to be an argument for God's existence, and it's a total failure at that. So I think to characterize it that way, I guess isn't really fair, because it's to say like, well, it doesn't prove God exists. It's not trying to, you know what I mean?
Right.
Okay, yeah, so we have this conclusion, right? You should believe in God, or we could make it broader. You should wager on God. We could talk more about whether it's all belief or something else. What is that? How do we establish that? And so they basically say, well, look, this really does in a lot of ways trace back to Pascal. I'm not taking as much of his historical approach, so I'll give kind of a more simple gloss and then note like even Pascal's version is arguably a little more complicated than this, so we can talk about more complicated versions. But here's the most simple gloss of the argument. There's really two options: believe in God, don't believe in God. And then there's two ways the world goes. God exists and God doesn't exist. And so we can use this kind of model, and it's really a simpler version of a more formal model known as decision theory. And we can kind of then we're basically doing a slightly more complex cost-benefit analysis. What would it be if I believed in God and God existed? We compare each of those four possibilities, and then we can kind of see what's the best overall sort of thing to do, considering all the pros and cons. So if you believe in God and God exists, the thought is things look really good for you. You have a potential connection with God, union with God, relationship with God. And if you go to heaven, in a lot of religious traditions, that's infinitely good. So a lot of people think believe in God, God exists, that's infinitely good. If God exists and you don't believe in God, I mean, religious people debate about that, right? Some people think there's damnation, there's hell. That would be infinitely bad. You actually don't need that for the argument to go through, though. As long as it's worse than infinitely good in some capacity, that's all you really need for the argument. And then the thought is, so those are the two possibilities if God exists. If God does not exist, then you can kind of reason like, okay, what would it be to believe in God if God doesn't exist? Well, you'd have a false belief. You might have to sacrifice some stuff by going to church and tithing and, giving money, whatever. And then if you believe in God, if you don't believe in God and God does not exist, well, you got it right. You have the true belief. Maybe there's less of the religious things you have to do, but then you also have to it's like there's the thought, like some people think there's psychological evidence that religious people are happier and healthier apart from whether God exists, so you kind of have to weigh all of that against each other. But the thought is really all that calculation, as interesting as it is, and I'm interested in that too, doesn't actually matter because of the power of infinity. If you have that infinite good, if you believe in God and God exists, then really it could be really positive, it could be really negative, and as long as it's some finite value, it really won't matter. So as long as believe in God and God exists is infinitely good, and the other three are less than infinitely good, no matter what their value is, it looks like, given the cost-benefit analysis, what you should do is believe in or wager on God. So again, that's really the most basic form of the argument. We're going to get into it more, and I'll talk more about how a lot of philosophers, I think it has to be more complicated than that to really be successful. But at least hopefully that gives the audience sort of the general intuition behind the argument. You have a lot to gain by believing in God, and you have, it's not saying you have nothing to lose, but a lot less to lose. So overall, you should believe in God.
Great. Yeah. Thank you for that primer. And actually, if I may share, Pascal's wager, it's quite personal to me. It had a massive impact on my life. So I went to Catholic school for 12 years. Cool. And I remember in my freshman Christology class, our professor, he told us about Pascal's wager. And I was already a believer. I mean, my family went to church every Sunday. We're Catholic. They still are. And I remember him laying out the argument, and I like tripled down on my faith. Like I became way more intense about the belief. I went to chapel every day, church, a few times a week. And it became a big part of my identity. And I was very happy about it. I mean, I look very favorably on that time of my life. But do you remember when you first learned about the wager and what kind of impact it had on you?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely became most interested in it as an undergraduate student. I was studying philosophy at Kansas State. And actually even my co-author of the main paper I think we're going to talk about, he was actually also a philosophy major at Kansas State. And that's kind of how we got together to write this paper. And so the school I was at, they kind of did more formal philosophy. A lot of them were working on decision theory questions. But there was a group of us that were all really interested in philosophy of religion. And so then it kind of like was a really natural topic for us to kind of converge on, them teaching us all this decision theory and us learning decision theory, but then also us wanting to kind of think about philosophy of religion implications for it. So I'm trying to remember if I like learned about the argument sooner, but I definitely got most into it kind of as a philosophy major. And then I think too, as my philosophical interests sort of developed, I started to see like it kind of playing a role in broader questions that I have about sort of, when is a religious commitment rational? How important or central should belief be to a religious commitment? What should we do if the evidence for God's existence is to some degree somewhat ambiguous? I mean, I don't want to take us too off track, but these are sort of now, I think, the way I view Pascal's wagers in light of sort of these broader issues having to do with sort of the rationality of religious commitment and what to say about sort of the ambiguity of the evidence for it, yes.
Yeah, that's great to hear. And I would love to share too how I discovered your paper just a few weeks ago. I was randomly watching this hour-long video by the channel Digital Gnosis. If you're familiar,
Nathan, I don't know how to say his last name. Sorry.
Actually, I don't know his name. That was one of the first
Nathan
videos
Ormond or something.
Yeah, he just came up my feed, and there's this hour-long video, and he devotes about 20 minutes of it to your paper, Salvaging Pascal's Wager. That's how I discovered it, and I was like floored by it and dove in. And it was like late at night too, one night, which is, I don't recommend people read existential papers before going to bed. Because
like traditional like late night YouTube, like usually when you go to a YouTube thing late at night, it's not in like technical decision theory and existential like should I commit to God questions. So anyway, I love it though.
It was a lot. I love it too, and it's funny too because and separately too. I have this YouTube channel, and I half of it's like kind of interviews with experts like yourself, and half of it is explainer videos, that kind of thing. And I've had on my list, I have hundreds of ideas for videos I could do, but for years now, I've had the idea of like a Pascal's Wager 2.0 of like, how do I, because it's something I just never totally took off my back, sort of. It's something that's always kind of stuck around. And discovering your paper, it's like, oh my God, this is exactly, I mean, not exactly, you formalized it. I mean, this is not, I knew that there was a way to strengthen the argument, and this paper does it. So could you possibly tell us, could you give us the thesis of your paper?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the way we sort of set up the paper, I mean, it is the most simple way of putting it, I think, is kind of what you said. It's sort of reformulating the wager, especially in light of some prominent objections that have been raised recently. And I think, I mean, it's funny because like you teach this to students in like a 101 philosophy class, but also you read the literature and similar objections actually come up. And one of the biggest ones is what people call the many gods objection, right? So we looked at a really simple 4x4 decision matrix, right? Should I believe in God or not? And then really all we considered was God exists, God doesn't exist. But in fact, that's kind of overly simple, because actually when we are actually trying to decide whether to be religious, there's a lot of different religions to choose from, and just believing in God normally isn't sufficient to, be considered a full-fledged member of the religion. There's sometimes you have to really do a lot more than that to, be part of the religion, go to heaven, etc. Right? And so if you start including different religions in the decision matrix and you say, okay, we'll have a column for Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, etc., etc., it just gets way more complicated, and then it's not at all clear what the right path is. I have if a reader wants to go, or a listener wants to go actually look at the paper, I have some sample decision matrices so you can kind of see how I show it. But basically what ends up happening is there's positive and negative infinities all over, and it's not really clear how you should decide between religions. So if on Christianity, especially if on Christianity, Muslims go to hell, and on Islam, Christians go to hell, or at least on some versions, it's just things get really complicated. And so the question is, how do we pick between religions? Which religion should we choose? And so at least the very simple gloss I gave, it doesn't help with that question, and it arguably makes it's not really useful to decide the question of which religion to practice. So that's one big worry. Do you want to camp out there for a second? Or, I mean, maybe I'll just, to fully answer your question, maybe I kind of already said this, but we consider that and one other big objection. And then our thesis is that we still have a version of the wager that gives us reasons to pay attention to these afterlife harms and benefits, even conceding these objections are fully successful. So that, I think, maybe fully answers your question, but I don't want to necessarily get too much into, or, too many different objections if you want to sort of talk more about one specific one.
Well, let's perhaps it might be helpful to clarify the conclusion of the paper, because I've listened to a few of your interviews, and they're very enjoyable to listen to. And it seemed like what this paper was making the case for was that you should choose the religion that you believe has the highest credence, or the highest probability of being accurate and being correct, right? And one of the things I thought was interesting, because when I read it the first time, what it seemed to me was that it actually potentially narrowed down the number of religions you should be taking a look at seriously, let's say, should be those with infinite utilities, both positive and negative. And so that actually started to make me think about, how should we consider something like Hinduism and Buddhism, which, believe in reincarnation. So you get to come back, if you screwed up, if you didn't choose the right one. And ostensibly, if you're a devout religious life, following some other religion, you're probably doing beneficial things for the society and for your community, et cetera. So you'll likely be reincarnated in something better, and you don't have to worry about this one-off game over eternal damnation or eternal pleasure in heaven, right? So it actually started to make me think about, would you say that's accurate? Is that like a proper leaning, or is that wrong?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. I mean, I think there's a couple caveats that may or may not matter for our purposes, and we can get into, but I think basically what you said is right, is I think on a pretty standard view of the way things are going to be in the afterlife and stuff, it would say, and here's how I would put it, incorporating both of the insights you just had, pick the religion that you think has the highest probability that has an infinite afterlife, something like that, or is making, claims about infinite value that are at stake, right? And so it would privilege religions that have infinities involved over those that don't, and then also privilege religions that have a higher probability over those that have a lower probability. So the question about reincarnation is really interesting, and I think that would depend on whether you're reincarnated forever or just for some, kind of finite period of time. Because if it's just a finite period of time, then arguably that's not, it's going to, at least the way we suggest making the decision is going to privilege the infinite religions over those. But if you're going to be reincarnated forever, I don't see a reason why you shouldn't pick that religion if you assign it the highest credence. So that's, I think, what our framework would say about those kinds of things.
Gotcha. And I like that you're tackling, so maybe we can go into the many gods objection a little bit, because that is a standard, a pretty common critique of Pascal's wager. And it's funny because even before reading your paper, I always thought that was like an interesting argument. And of course, an obvious one, because during Pascal's time, there really weren't, well, there were other religions sure to choose from, but I'm sure for the audience he was writing for, it was basically like Christianity or bust. It wasn't like they had all these other different options, right?
Exactly.
But now, and of course you can lay out that there's an infinite number of different gods and all these different kinds of things. But I've always found the many gods objection to be like, the retort to that is that, yes, maybe it's hard, or maybe it's difficult to decide or choose, but one thing is true. Like there is not a god, or that there is a god, and it could be many different gods.
Right.
So, and you have to choose, or you have to at least, you don't actually get to not make a choice. This is what Pascal said. Your life is the gamble. What you're living is the gamble.
Absolutely.
And it's funny too, because there's just, I'm sure you're familiar with the term like satisficing. Satisficement in economics, where yes, you can get inundated with all these options, and there are so many options to choose from, but you do have to at some point kind of throw your hands up and say this. Make the best determination of what it is. So do you think that's do you see the many gods objection similarly, or do you have any other ways to fight against it?
No, I mean, I love all your points, and I just want to kind of add a little bit. So the first is the point like about Pascal, and I think that's exactly right. Not only would Pascal's audience, I think, mostly say it's either Christianity or atheism, something like that. But actually, if you read the Pensée like as a whole, and again, this isn't my area of expertise, but I know enough about it that
sure.
I know exactly, kind of the general idea. So Pascal argues that Christianity, if a religion is true, it's going to be Christianity, really through, some various different kinds of arguments involving fulfilled prophecy and stuff. And, of course, we should look at those arguments on their own merits. I'm not saying those are obviously successful and we can't question them. Of course not. But if you're already in that context, then where Pascal thinks he's sufficiently argued, really it's either Christianity or atheism, then the many gods objection is just not clear it's really going to come up. And so that's why I say, when I give that really basic wager, that's like the most basic form that's arguably even not totally true to what Pascal himself said, because he had already kind of established, he at least tried to establish Christianity is the religion that's most likely to be true. So that's the first thing to note, is that the many gods objection arguably isn't a problem for the historical sort of reading of Pascal. But yeah, then now I'm trying to remember the second point. The second point, or one, there were several points, but another point you made is like, we still have to decide, like, does God exist or does God not exist? And then you could arguably say the next decision from there is like which religion to practice. And so there's a sense in which the question of whether to commit to, believe in, wager on God or not is arguably just like, it's a reasonable decision to kind of consider in its own right. And then once you make that decision, if you decide to wager on God, then sort of going to try to figure out which religion to practice, you could arguably view as like an additional next decision, right? And so I think that is like a totally fair thing to do. And that in some ways really complements what we say in the paper, which is like, at that point, look at the probabilities, right? Like, look at which religion is most likely. We obviously also think making the claims about infinite values is important, and those are going to be the ones the wager is going to privilege. But I'm not at all someone that says just ignore the probabilities and throw those out. And, I think maybe there were people that had hoped we could get a version of Pascal's wager where the probabilities just didn't matter at all and we didn't need to think about that at all. I think that, no, we really do need to think about those probabilities, especially if you're going to that second step of deciding which religion to practice. But that's okay. Right? We like probabilities. We like evidence. That stuff is good too. It's not a purely pragmatic argument, but I still think it's powerful and interesting and does a lot of interesting work.
Thank you. Yeah, that's great. And there are other. So it's funny because I'm not sure which direction to go in here, because there's other objections to Pascal's wager, and even perhaps objections to your paper. But I think what we're probably going to do is we're probably going to agree on everything, which is fine. It's not as though it's like not like as though I've made up my mind and all this stuff. But there are certain things like, so I have this like these notes here, and it's like weak objections, in my opinion. But a lot of other atheists would say these are strong objections, but I don't think so. So something like the terminology around, say, like belief.
Mm.
And it's funny because this is something that a lot of people get really hung up on, and I understand it to a degree, that people could say things like, I can't choose to believe. There's that aspect of it. There's that kind of angle. And the other side of it is this idea, and I come from a Catholic background. So, in some Protestant faiths, as belief, they say belief alone is enough to grant you salvation. At least in my tradition, in the Catholic faith, that wasn't enough. You need to also act in accordance with the faith. So
Yeah.
what I always find is like, we can just change that word from belief to like, I don't know, proper living or proper action or something, and kind of get away from this kind of muddleness. Do you agree with that? Is there anything else? Any other thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I think kind of the question, one way to put the question is like, what is it to wager? What is, when we talk about wagering, I had initially just said belief, but I don't think we have to say belief. We could say it's belief plus some other stuff. We could say it's just some other stuff.
Yeah.
And I think there's different ways you can go here. I'm not actually super committed to one interpretation of that. I think there are interesting ways of getting the wager going while still somewhat focusing on belief, or maybe belief plus some other stuff, right? But I also think a lot of people in the current literature will say, let's move away from belief and focus more on action, focus more on making a religious commitment, pursuing a relationship with God, those kinds of things. So there are, like you said, worries about whether we could control our beliefs, whether we could just jump in and believe something. And it's going to depend on the person, I think, too, right? Like, whether it's going to be easier for you to choose to believe in God or not will partially depend on how strong you think the evidence is for and against, right? And if you're just this like utterly convinced atheist, it might be a lot more difficult. But if you're kind of more torn, more on the fence, then it's not clear to me that it's going to be such a hard thing to, make a decision to believe or get yourself into a framework that will make it likely for you to believe, that kind of thing. So I do think like that's one example of how I think we can actually keep it focused on belief and still have an answer to the objection. But the other way people will go is say, don't even make Pascal's wager about belief at all. Make it about a commitment. That is something we clearly have control over, right? You can control whether you go to church, pray, read the Holy Scripture, hang out with religious people, read the arguments. You can control those kinds of things. And so I'm open to kind of either interpretation. And I guess the bottom line is I think there's different ways you can respond to this that are all plausible. If you're really set on not making it about belief, that's fine with me. But I think there are ways we can keep belief as part of the equation and still have an interesting response.
Cool. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah.
And there's other objections. I think we might even have time at the end to come back to some of these, but
yeah.
One of the things I wanted to dive in the most with you was around the math. So the decision theory.
Yeah.
Because
Love
it's a tough one. I'm not a mathematician, but you did an interview a few years ago with Alex O'Connor, a cosmic skeptic, and I know that was like very much framed as like sort of a debate. So you two were, and a big hang up there, and I think is around the absorption property with infinity. So actually, would you mind explaining that to the audience?
Yeah, no, and that was like a little frustrating because in a debate/discussion setting, when you're trying to introduce some technical stuff, it's just hard to get through to the audience while also remaining, in the proper debate style. So there were some things that were a little like, I'm not blaming Alex, but it was just frustrating to like try to do the technical stuff in that kind of setting. But yeah, so the mathematics of infinities is a really interesting topic because infinities arguably behave in some ways differently than traditional numbers, at least prima facie or on the surface, right? So, when you 1 plus 1, that's going to equal 2, right? There's going to be something added to the initial 1 to give you the 2, right? 1 times 2 is going to equal 3, right? So you're getting these different numbers out when you're multiplying and when you're adding. I know that sounds really stupid to even say that, but you'll see why in a second. Yeah. Because when you're adding things to 1, it's giving more. You're ending up with more. Okay. Infinities, at least in the one way they're often treated in math, they absorb numbers that are added and multiplied instead of those actually adding to them. So for example, infinity plus one, some people say, it seems like it's just infinity, right? Infinity times 5 is infinity. Infinity times a billion is infinity, right? And this is actually somewhat part of Pascal's original, or at least the simple version of Pascal's original wager, because this is why the thought is the probability you assign to God's existence doesn't matter as long as it's greater than 0, right? Because you're multiplying by infinity. That's just how you calculate that. I can go into it more if you want, but when I was talking about that, the cost benefit analysis, or the decision question we're trying to calculate, what you're going to do is you're multiplying the probability God exists by how good it would be if you believed in God and God existed, for example, right? And as long as that is infinity, you could give the probability 90%, or you could give the probability 0.00001%, and you're going to get that infinite expected value, which is basically the value of that decision from your standpoint of uncertainty about God's existence. So anyway, because the simple version of the wager and infinities have that absorption property, it's in some sense a very powerful tool, right? It means like no matter, the probabilities don't matter because infinities are going to absorb everything and mean that you should believe in it right or not. Okay, but then this is also where the powerful aspect of Pascal's wager is in some ways also its big downfall. And I think this is brought out both in the many gods objection, but also in another objection that's called the mixed strategies objection. So it's the second big objection we talk about in the paper. Okay, so you might say, look, let's say I have a 50% probability that God exists, a 0.5 credence, right? Multiply that by infinity. Let's say I'm trying to figure out, should I commit to God? Well, okay, if I commit to God and God exists, that's infinitely good. Multiply that by my 0.5 credence, it's infinite, okay? And then the mixed strategies objection says, well, look, what if you did this instead? What if you flipped a coin? If that coin lands heads, commit to God. But if the coin lands tails, you don't do anything. You go on your merry way and keep living your life, okay? That sounds so silly, right? Like, why would you ever do that? But here's what's so interesting. It has to do with this absorption property thing, right? Because you now only have a 50% chance of making the commitment to God. We're assuming you haven't flipped the coin yet, right? You're just planning to. And then you have 0.5. Then you, of course, still bring your credence in, 0.5. And normally that would make the probability lower. But because infinities are just going to absorb everything, you're still going to get that same infinite payoff. So the point here, I hope I haven't said it in a too complicated way, but it's that no matter whether you directly just make a commitment wagering on believing in God, or 2, flip a coin, and if that coin lands heads, then commit to God, those are both going to have that same infinite payoff, that same infinite expected value. And that seems kind of wild. So, but then you can take that even further. So it's like, I should be indifferent between wagering on God and flipping a coin, and if the coin lands heads, wagering on God, okay? Well, what if I commit to God only if a quantum tunnel just appears in my front yard in the next 5 minutes, right? Or only if I win the lottery next week, right? Just take these really not 0 probability, but very improbable events and say, I'll commit to God, but only if that happens. You're going to get the same math, right? It's going to absorb that tiny probability, and you're still going to get the infinite payoff. And so then what it looks like is Pascal's wager isn't really telling us, like, it's really saying any decision that is consistent with there being some probability of you committing to God is going to have that infinite payoff. And so there's not really any reason to commit to God directly rather than perform any of these mixed strategies, which will have the exact same expected value in the end, which is, again, sort of the value we're assigning to that action and the value that we were initially relying on when we made that initial argument. So I don't know. Does that make sense? Do you want me to expand on anything, or?
Yeah, no, I think it does.
Yeah.
I think it's a tough because there's a conflict between the math and where this bears out. I actually think the example you give about the choosing between 2 doors. And how,
good.
Yeah, if you wouldn't mind sharing that. Yeah.
Good. So that's kind of the objection. So, and I'll just say too, that's not me giving my response to it yet. That's the worry. The worry is So the many gods objection got us to the point where we're like, we can't pick between religions, right? This objection, the mixed strategies objection, gets us to the point where like all decisions have an infinite expected value.
Right.
we can't pick between any decisions at all. Someone joked that like, well, now we know that God exists because all decisions have an infinite expected value. Only a good God would make the world that good, but that's a joke.
Yeah.
So,
Right.
but the point is, it's now Pascal's wager just seems useless for all decision making. Okay, so here's my response and the thought experiment that we try to use to motivate why really what's causing these issues is that absorption property. And as nice as that was for the original wager, we actually think we got to get rid of it. So you die, you go to heaven, you're standing there. Maybe, okay, you're not in heaven yet, actually. Sorry.
Yeah, outside the gates.
You're at the gates, gates of heaven. And it's actually, there's not one gate, there's two gates. And God says, okay, I'm going to give you a shot at getting into heaven. It's not 100%, you get it, but you get to make the choice. You pick gate number 1. You have a 99.9999999 chance at getting into this eternal, blissful, amazing, it's the best state, the best experience of your life. So infinite good, 99.999% chance, okay? Gate number 2, you can get that same good. You have a chance at that same good. And it's not 0. It's 0.0000001, right? And either, if you pick one and, the probabilities don't turn out in your favor, then let's say you'll be annihilated, you'll cease to exist, okay? So we're like, okay, well, we got this absorption property, right? Infinities absorb probabilities, infinity times any positive probability is infinity. Multiply infinity by 0.99999, whatever, it's infinite. Multiply infinity by 0.0000001, it's infinite. And then what? Okay, I guess we flip a coin to decide. Close your eyes and choose random. Like obviously not. Okay, I mean, at that point, I think we've reached an absurdity, and clearly we should pick the 0.99999 chance over the 0.0001, right? And so what this is supposed to show is like, look, I'm even saying there's maybe some mathematical places where it's appropriate to have this absorption property, but it's not appropriate in our decision making when we're making decisions surrounding infinities and infinite values. We should not attribute this absorption property to infinities. Okay, so we say get rid of the absorption property. Infinities do not absorb probabilities and other finite values. And then look, once you do that, the mixed strategies objection is actually dissipates, right? Because if you say, look, we're going to treat infinity differently, so, and there's complicated, we can go into it more if you want, but there's mathematical ways to do this. You can use Surreals, you can use Hyperreals. In our paper, we suggest limits and ratios. There's different ways to do it, but the upshot is that taking a strategy where you directly commit to God, directly wager on God, that's going to look better in terms of the value than taking a strategy where you do that if your lottery ticket wins or if the coin lands heads or whatever, because the probabilities are going to start mattering. And the case where you directly wager on God is going to look like door number 1, where the probability is way higher. The case where you take the mixed strategy and only do it if the coin lands heads or if your lottery ticket wins is going to look like door number 2, where your probability is way lower. So again, and maybe I've said this too many times, but probabilities have to matter. So you can't get the version of Pascal's wager that says, ignore the probabilities, ignore your credences, you should wager on God. But at the same time, I still think we can get an interesting version of the wager going that's going to be, controversial and interesting enough to work with, despite having to sort of give up that powerful, just ignore all probabilities and only focus on the pragmatic stuff feature of the original argument.
Yeah, that's great. I think the example of the 2 doors or 2 gates really helps get that point across. The other thing I think about too is that, and I get that in decision theory, you maximize for expected value, right? So there's 2 actually branching here things here. One, infinity might have this absorption property, or I think most, correct me if I'm wrong, but most mathematicians would say infinity absorbs, right? But then there's this chance that in other ways of calculating infinity, the absorption property doesn't occur, right? So you have to kind of like weigh those factors or weigh the probabilities of you have to weigh the probabilities of the absorption property in mathematics or in this specific situation, right? But let's say you do think the absorption property holds. Even in that case, why wouldn't it be the case that sorry, I'm leading the question here, I'm leading the answer here. But it seems to me like if the EVs are the same, expected values are the same, then why not have like a second determining factor be the probabilities of the states?
Yeah.
Like, it doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to me to say, well, it's a toss-up here. What other facts can we bring into this? What other tiebreakers can we make here to try to make the best decision? And let's do that. Does that make any sense?
Yeah, for sure. It's almost like you have your decision table, you have your expected value calculation, and if they're the same, there's some other sort of rule you then apply or incorporate to pick between, let's say there's 5 that are all at the top, they're all infinite, then you apply some other rule to make a decision. Yeah, so I totally, I think you could do that, or you could try to like incorporate that into your calculation of expected value. I will say I'm not an expert on the math of infinity. I'm a philosopher, so but my sense is that they just have different ways of modeling infinity that have different kinds of properties. So there's actually technically ordinals and cardinals,
right.
And then there's like hyperreals and surreals, and so I think some of these will and won't have the absorption property, but as long as you model it with numbers that don't, I think you can do more the second thing I was saying and get the result where it's reflected in the expected values. But like I think that's also another really interesting way to go, is like treat it as like something that's applied afterwards. I think it would end up mathematically having the same upshot, but maybe it's a way to like concede something to someone that's very set on using a certain model of infinity or something.
Yeah, sure. Or I mean, if you're in that position where you have the 2 gates and it's like, how many people are going to go with the 0.001% chance? It's like, go for it if you want. I mean, but I'm not going to choose that one. I'll say that much.
And this is where I felt like there was like a little bit of a disconnect in that conversation with Alex O'Connor you were talking about, because I wasn't trying to say like, give up the math because of my like religious reasons that are from the Bible. I was saying like, look, we want our math to reflect this like very intuitively obvious point, which is that pick the higher chance over the lower chance when you're looking at infinite options. You know what I mean? So I felt like there was a little bit of a disconnect there, and maybe I could have articulated some things better in the moment. But that really was the point I was trying to make, is like, look, we want our math to reflect these like very, very obvious common sense decisions that I think anyone that hears that case just automatically sees like, no, it's obvious you should pick, the first door over the second door.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And in a debate, and this is actually one of the reasons why I don't really love debates in general, it's that if you give any territory to your opponent, then like, it's like you've lost, right? You can't really be, it's hard to be gracious and try to work together to find a solution to a problem. So I'd love to talk about, so we have this infinite absorption property. I was thinking too, what if instead you just used, a supermassive number? So, like I looked very quickly before this to Rayo's number is like the biggest defined number. You can always add +1, but it's like it's such a huge number. I think I was watching a number file video that they said that like if you wrote a symbol for every value in Rayo's number, starting with like the beginning of time, and you had a symbol for every Planck second or Planck unit of time, you wouldn't have enough time to write down all the symbols. So it's like such a mass number. It's way bigger than a Googleplex, etc. And I mean, that's just one. Of course, it's still a finite number. But if you ran these calculations for just this like a massive number, I imagine you would end up coming to much of the same conclusions as you do with infinity, and then you don't run into this absorption property problem. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And I'm very open to that way of going too. A lot of, the Rayo's numbers thing's interesting, and I haven't heard people specifically appeal to that. Might be a nice thing to appeal to, actually, though, as just a concrete example. So I think that's great. But there are like Mike Rhoda, some other kind of contemporary defenders of the wager do say this. They're like, infinities cause these problems. There's just like all these technical issues and philosophical issues, and so let's just use really big finite numbers and then do the calculation with that, and you do really get pretty similar results. I will say, though, there is a special kind of power that infinities add that really, really big finite numbers don't, which is that if you assign like the value of, let's say, wagering on God, if God exists, a really big finite number, in theory, someone could have a credence that's 1 over that finite number, and then it's non-zero, but they don't have to take the wager, right? So there's going to be less people that your wager is going to appeal to, and as you make that finite number bigger, like Reyes' number again, but that would be good for this. Your credence is going to have to be lower and lower for you not to be included as a part of that. But there are sort of ways to go, like if you use infinities, your credence has to be 0 or infinitesimal. But if you use finite numbers, you could have just a really, really, really low credence. So that's sort of the trade-off, but there is like the ease and calculation and getting rid of some of the technicalities that infinities introduce. So again, I'm pretty open to, you could call them finite versions of the wager or whatever, as well as infinite ones. Yeah, for sure.
I was wondering too that I don't think I heard this come up in any of your interviews, but so the afterlife, I was wondering about the afterlife and if it's like, it's hard with time because what is time and like another dimension, right? But I was thinking about it, like infinity, the hard thing with infinity, it has no beginning and no end. But if you have an afterlife, you technically have a beginning to the afterlife, right? There would be, unless we're in it right now, which would be like really cosmically kind of crazy, but possible. But so that made me think like it can be never ending, but it can't be never beginning, if that makes any sense. So the afterlife has a start. So is there potentially like a limit to the infinite utility because it has to commence at some point?
Okay, here's how I think about it. Like, it has a beginning, but it goes on forever. And so, like, that's infinite insofar as, like, the natural numbers are infinite. Like, 1, 2, 3. Like, it has a beginning, but it goes on forever, right? So, I guess if you, like, could try to motivate an afterlife that, like, was, like, there's, like, one that goes on forever, but then it like, has no beginning, and that, like, you start going into all the negatives or something. You know what I mean? I don't know. Then, like, maybe that could... I don't know. I mean, I would have to think more and might, look into the math of how you might model something with a beginning but no end versus something with no beginning or no end. But yeah, I mean, I would say, like, I think most of the traditional afterlives are infinite in the sense that the natural numbers are, but not in the sense of, like, not having a beginning. So that's an interesting prospect that's, like, hard for me to think about. And I guess there are, like, weird philosophical views where, like, your soul pre-exists the existence of your body. I mean, I don't know. And maybe there's, like, you could have, like, a reincarnation view that's like this. So then you actually don't have a beginning either. I don't know. I'm kind of just spitballing there. So it's an interesting prospect. But I do think you can maintain, even if it has a beginning, there's still a relevant sense in which the afterlife is plausibly infinite because it has to end.
Oh, sure.
Yeah.
Cool. So let's see. There's so many different places I could go here. I'll have to touch on a little bit. How would one... What are some ways that someone, let's say someone agrees with your argument, and now they have all these options now. They're at the religious buffet and they're trying to figure out what they need to do. Oh, buffet is not so great because you're taking multiple from different places. But let's say you have to order one thing, one dish. What are some ways you would recommend people? And this is a little bit tough because I believe you are Christian, so you're biased. Let's say someone was an objective person, an atheist, and they had no sort of leaning one way or the other. What are some ways you would recommend someone to start assigning credences and to start figuring out what to believe?
Yeah. I mean, I think it's a good question. And maybe the first thing I'll say is just a caveat before this is, like, and especially in this paper, but really not any of my papers, do I try to say Pascal's wager means everyone has to be a Christian, right?
Yeah,
that's not
for sure.
Really the goal of it. I am a Christian and I'm happy to be open about that and talk about that. But I don't see a way to get just appealing to pragmatic considerations that's going to motivate you having to wager on Christianity as opposed to other religions with, a similar structure, right? So so that's the first thing to say. I mean, when looking at religions and compare, I mean, it's an interesting question because it's partially philosophical, partially practical. And of course, the first thing to do is do your best to understand the religions and the claims they're making, and then most importantly, sort of evaluate the various sources of evidence for those claims, right? And I'm biased, so you can take this with a grain of salt, but I often think that philosophers that are working in a particular area, like there's in philosophy of religion, for example, it is a lot of Christians, of course. That's, I mean, maybe not of course, but it is kind of dominated by Western Christianity. But there's some really excellent people doing Jewish philosophy, Muslim philosophy, and so insofar as you can, I think, kind of looking at what those people have to say and their arguments. And of course, I mean, I'm not saying only philosophy; other disciplines can be great as well. But often I find like there's a special kind of rigor that philosophers can bring to the table. And so sort of looking at the kind of claims they make, the versions of the religions they endorse, and really trying to be charitable, I think, is important, because there is within a religion often a lot of different versions of it, and not everyone in the religion believes the same things. And so figuring out what the core claims of the religion are, in Christianity, it would be claims about, of course, God existing, Jesus being God, Jesus rising from the dead, maybe something about the Trinity. Even there, I'm not totally sure if that's totally essential, but those kinds of claims are much more important than, I don't know, believing certain things about the end times or the age of the earth, or those things are much less important. So figuring out what those core claims are seems quite important. And then, like I said, trying to find the best arguments for and against those, really looking at what the top scholars have to say. And actually, YouTube can be actually a really great resource if you're not into jumping into papers. Like, of course, I read them. It sounds like you often also do read journal articles, but not everyone's down to just go jump into a bunch of journal articles. But there's actually so many good resources on YouTube. And in philosophy, there's Philosophy Compass, Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. They're slightly more accessible sort of overview resources that can be really helpful as well. So and then I think that's the more intellectual part, and of course there's also the more practical part, right? Like checking out a religious service, meeting some people that endorse that religion. That's going to be more personal, more based on the feel you get at those services, much more of a practical thing, but I think an important thing to do nonetheless.
Yeah, well, thank you for that. That's wonderful. And actually, yes, thank you for correcting me, because I didn't want to say that you were going to try to.
Oh no,
with your papers, like the papers I've read, you are as objective as you could possibly be. I mean, I don't see any bias in terms of actually in your paper. And this actually got me when I first read it. You actually give as the example in the paper the highest credence to Islam, which I thought was interesting, or maybe perhaps a way that you were going about just trying to be as impartial as you could possibly be. And then that got me. I was looking at mosques in my neighborhood, like oh my gosh, well, I've been Christian this whole time, and then I really got into the paper, and then I realized, this is just an example. She wasn't actually saying the credence is the highest.
And that's the interesting thing about decision theory too in general, is a lot of it depends on your inputs, which is going to depend on the probabilities you assign. And no one doing decision theory, it's not trying to tell you what credences to have. That's not the point of decision theory. That's a separate debate in epistemology that's important, but no one's here saying you got to assign this credence to Islam, this credence to Christianity. That's where doing what I was just saying, comparing the arguments, looking at the evidence for and against, that's where that's going to come in. But that's going to come, you can either view it as before or after, maybe before decision theory, because then you're going to input those into the decision table.
Do you think that there's any, I feel like this is a controversial thing between, say, theologians, I actually don't hear it discussed that often, if we should perhaps put any weight at all on a belief's veracity by its number of followers. So, there's 2.3 billion Christians, about 1.8 billion Muslims, a billion Hindus, 500 million Buddhists. Should that factor into our consideration?
I love this. I think this is a really interesting philosophical question. And here's why. You might think the answer is just obviously no, that's a stupid way to calculate things. And I think if that's all you think about, that's probably not right. It shouldn't be the only thing you think about. But there's an argument called the argument from divine hiddenness. So maybe you've heard of it. I don't know. But J.L. Schellenberg's one of the kind of main proponents of it. And the thought is, look, if God existed, the thought is God's perfectly loving, powerful, and on a lot of traditions wants some kind of connection or relationship with God's creatures. And the thought, I mean, Schellenberg thinks these considerations are ultimately an argument God doesn't exist, because there's people that want a connection with God but don't have that connection. So God is hidden for them, and it's like, why would God allow that at all? And that's a way you can go. It's an interesting argument. There's responses from theists, a piece of evidence to look at when you're kind of looking at the evidence for and against it forth. Yeah. But there's actually a spin on this argument, and the video I saw, it's by this guy. He just has a YouTube channel called Apologetics Squared.
Oh yeah, I was going to ask you about that.
Heard of him? Yeah. No, he's great. His name's, well, maybe I don't know if he wants me to say his name, so maybe I won't. But he's I met him at a conference anyway. But his thought was, look, if we set aside the question of, like, just for a second, don't think about whether that proves that God exists or not, but use that kind of Schellenberg type reasoning to think about which religion would, if a religion is true, which one is most likely to be true. That type of reasoning, like God is loving, God would want people to have true beliefs about God, have a relationship with God. That kind of reasoning seems to suggest that perhaps one of the more dominant religions with more followers and more people being aware of the true nature of God would, in some sense, be more likely to be true, or at least that's some kind of evidence, even if it's weak evidence, for that religion. So I'm not here necessarily defending or endorsing that argument, but I do think it's like an interesting kind of line worth considering. It's like, insofar as you're kind of convinced by this divine hiddenness stuff, that's motivating divine hiddenness, you might think, at least it would be surprising if God was like not like any of the major religions say, and totally different, and most of us are wrong about God. If God is truly personal and perfectly loving and powerful and desiring a connection and a relationship with people, and for people to at least have a decent amount of true beliefs about God, Yeah. So anyway, it's an interesting, I mean, again, not necessarily here to like hardcore endorse it, but it's an interesting, maybe what this could say about Pascal's wager is, start with, if you have no idea where to start, maybe start with some of the major religions, investigating those first. And of course, this consideration from Schellenberg is going to be defeasible, and you're going to want to look at the other evidence too. But it can at least be like a guiding point in terms of where to start. Yeah,
it's helpful. And actually, the Apologetics Squared video that I saw, it was yesterday. I think he mentions your paper. I believe that's how I found it, or that's why it was recommended to me.
He's interested in Pascal's wager, I know. He had this funny video that was like, atheists should all delete their channels. Did you see that one? Because of major reasoning. Yeah, it's an interesting video for sure.
Yeah, the conclusion to one of his videos, though, and I have to rewatch it or to try to really grok it fully, but I wrote this down. He said at the end, your job as an agent is to search out the ultimate good. That really stuck with me, thinking about that. That you should continue to explore until you've found it, to search it out. And I don't know, I think that's relevant to what we're talking about.
Like the good and the true and the beautiful. Like, I think all of those have a role. And like, some theists think all of that's God, right? But like, whether you think that or not, I think those are all important things to orient your life around. That are like of fundamental and ultimate significance. So
sure.
Yeah, I like that.
Let's see. Would you mind sharing too? What denomination are you?
I would not strongly correlate myself with a certain denomination, but I have gone to Presbyterian churches. I like that they have a little more liturgy, but not. It's kind of in the middle, and so I've enjoyed that. And we've also just found good community. We have a son and places that have nice kids programs and stuff too, and so we've found ourselves, I guess, our last 3 churches, we've been moving a lot because of various complicated reasons I don't need to get into now, but the last 3 churches we've been at that we've settled on have all been Presbyterian. So I wouldn't say I'm like hardcore Presbyterian, and in fact I'm definitely not Calvinist, like, at all. But I have found the churches we've liked haven't been like the hardcore like, maybe some people there are Calvinist, and that's fine. Like, I can go to church with people I have theological disagreements with, but they're not like hardcore preaching fire and brimstone Calvinism from the pulpit, which I'm personally not super into. So
yeah, sure, me neither. Actually, fire and brimstone, that actually brings to the last section. Back to us, but also very particular topics I want to talk about hell, because Well, I guess from a personal perspective, I had sort of I fell away from my religion in college. It's not too uncommon, but
Yeah.
and in part, and I think the biggest hang up I had, and the thing I still to this day can't really get around. I could explain how I could potentially get around it in some other fashion, but it is this problem of hell. And I know you had another paper where you reference that there are, theologians who argue why that would be feasible, but I can't seem to get around the fact that I'm sure some listeners too, of an all-powerful, all-loving God who would allow something to come into existence, who could, knowing that existence is going to go to heaven, is going to end up in eternal hell, and or possibly have the eternal, even if it's by choice, or someone else's choice, that they can end up in eternity of just suffering and negative infinite utility, right? Do you find that? Do you have any difficulty with that yourself, or yeah?
Totally. I mean, no, I think it's been a huge, especially in college. I'm not saying it's not a difficulty now, but maybe I'll tell you why it's less for now. But I think it was just really, it's just such a hard doctrine to understand. So what I want to say first off is, again, I'm coming from a biased perspective of philosophy and also hanging out with like Christian philosophers a lot, right? But I will say the vast majority of Christian philosophers are universalists, or at least think universalism is very likely. And I do not think you have to believe in hell to be a Christian. I see no reason why that needs to be a core doctrine. And when you actually look at the text, there are some passages suggesting there's something like hell. There's also really interesting passages like Romans 5 that say in Adam all sinned and in Christ all will be made alive. And so it's like, it's easy to sort of read the Bible through a lens if you already believe in hell, where you're sort of paying attention to some passages and not others, or interpreting those away or whatever. But I actually think when you look at the biblical text, I'm not an expert on this, by the way, and I'm not a biblical scholar, but it is actually more mixed than you might think. And I think, again, this is coming from the perspective of philosophers, but a lot, like I would say, significantly more than 50% of Christian philosophers are going to be universalists, and then a good chunk of those that aren't would be annihilationists. Oh, did you break up? Gotcha. Should I repeat something?
Oh no, I think I were fine. But
okay.
Would you mind, for the audience, explaining what universalism is?
Oh, yes, absolutely. So universalism is the view that everyone goes to heaven, or at least ends up there eventually, right? So it could be that there's some kind of purgatory or some kind of purifying temporary state in the afterlife, but then by some mechanism that is probably in a lot of ways beyond our knowledge and understanding, all those people eventually are purified to the point of going to heaven. So that's universalism. Everyone ends up in heaven. And then annihilationism is the view that the people that don't end up in heaven, it's not that they go to hell, but they cease to exist. And so one kind of compelling consideration, not a biblical one, but a philosophical one, I heard for this one time, is like, there's something very depressing about being in heaven, in this place of eternal paradise, knowing your friends and family, and I mean, this would support both universalism and annihilationism, I guess, but knowing your friends and family and others are just suffering in this awful place, right? And it would feel like this like dualistic, like these parallel universes, one super good, one super bad. That would seem to put a big taint on heaven. Not saying there's not responses people could give to that, but if you either think those people cease to exist, or if you think they all actually end up in heaven, I think that that worry sort of goes away. So that's one thing to say. And I do think maybe we can talk about this next, but I want to say one more thing first. I don't think you have to believe in hell to endorse Pascal's wager. So I'll say that. But the other thing I want to say is like another view I find kind of interesting is a view where there is a hell, but there's like 6 people there. It's like Hitler, Mao, like these people that have just like done these horrible, horrible things, like that just have put them so far away from God that like, even if God, like, I believe God is merciful and loving and wants to give people a second chance, but maybe they've just done such awful, awful things, and maybe they continue to do awful things when they're in hell, so that it's not like this infinite punishment for this finite crime, but it's this finite crime, finite punishment thing. But like, maybe there's like 5 people in hell. So that's my other like possible. I know it sounds silly, but it's like when you think like, I went to Auschwitz 2 summers ago, like just like the evil there is just unimaginable. And I think doing something like that makes me think, if Hitler did end up in hell, that's a very different question and different struggle for me than if like 75% of the people from the world be like, you know what I mean? So anyway, those are sort of two different ways. One, universalism, or like hell, but just a very few amount of people that I've kind of, I think philosophers, or, I myself included, have kind of come to at this point. So
yeah. And I think, I'm not sure, I don't think it was in this paper, maybe it was in one of your other papers, but you wrote that there might be reasons why people prefer hell over annihilationism.
Yeah.
Could you explain that? Yeah.
Yeah, no, so that was, okay. I won't go into it too much, but the idea was that insofar as you're trying to learn about the world, get knowledge, get understanding, get justification, that in that kind of context, actually being in hell, but continuing to get that knowledge, that understanding that might come from hell, might be preferable to ceasing to exist and not having an opportunity to learn anything at all. I guess the only other thing I could say that might support that wasn't from that paper, but just otherwise, is if annihilationism is permanent, but there's a chance of leaving hell, someone might prefer hell to ceasing to exist for that reason. So, two thoughts. I don't know.
Getting out, yeah. Let's see. And then, do you have any other plans for this, like further research or anything else, project stemming off of this paper?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've written a couple papers since this one. Just kind of, one of them is sort of this idea. So I think this paper is more talking about people who aren't religious and how they might use Pascal's wager to pick between religions and responding to objections. But one thing you mentioned that at the beginning of the interview I thought was really interesting was how, as a religious person, Pascal's wager actually had an impact on you. And so I'm also really interested in what Pascal's wager might say to religious people, or objections religious people might have to Pascal's wager. And so I wrote a paper. Basically, a lot of religious people say someone that becomes religious as a result of Pascal's wager, that's like a terrible reason to make a religious commitment. Like, you're just scared of hell, or you want to go to heaven. Like, you can't, like, that's just a fake. It's like faking it, It's like someone who's dating someone for their money. You know what I mean? Like, you're not really, it's not a true commitment. It's not a true relationship. Yeah, right. And so I kind of tried to respond to that. I mean, the first thing I think to say there is, like, sometimes we enter into something with more questionable motives, but it turns into something else through the process. The process itself kind of transforms us. And so even if it's a bad reason to initially make a commitment, I think that commitment can be transformed into something real and genuine. But I also think, too, being motivated by the possibility of the goodness of God, the goodness of heaven, the goodness of a relationship with God, even if you're very, very skeptical that it's true, I don't think is automatically just a terrible reason to pursue a religious commitment. You're like, look, if God existed, God's all powerful, God's all good, God made everything, wrongs will be made right, evils will be rectified. Like, that would be such a good thing that it's worth me taking the risk to commit my life to it, even if at the moment I consider it to be very unlikely. And so one of that paper, I kind of tried to sketch a way that someone could make a religious commitment on the basis of Pascal's wager, and that be really genuine and virtuous. And so that's kind of more in conversation with religious people being skeptical of Pascal's wager. And then I think, the other thing I want to say too is I'm also just interested in, that was more an objection, responding to an objection, but like, if a religious person encounters Pascal's wager, like, what might that say to them, or what might that do for them? And one thing I think is that it gives you reasons beyond just evidential reasons to continue in your commitment. And maybe that's sort of what you experienced. I don't know. But even as a religious person, like, the evidence, like I said at the beginning, I think the evidence is complicated. There's counter evidence. The problem of evil is hard. Hiddenness, which we talked about, is hard. And even if there are arguments for, it's like, it's a complicated lot of evidence, and you're countering people that disagree with you. There's really smart people that are not Christians, that are not theists at all. And so Pascal's wager can kind of give you reasons that go beyond just the evidence to kind of continue in that religious commitment. And I think give a little more stability to that commitment than if you were just basing it on the sort of whims of your changing evidence, if that makes sense. So yeah, I think kind of maybe exploring that aspect of the wager is something I'd like to think more about in future work as well.
That's cool. Yeah, as an N of one, I mean, from my experience, what I can recall is I became far more religious or far more devout. But then after some time, I don't know, months, years, I forgot about the wager. It's not like something I kept on thinking about. So it was like, it's hard to explain or hard to really, I mean, whenever we're trying to make sense of our prior actions, it's like, good luck with that. But
totally.
From what I can recall, I remember it pushing me forward, but then I had enough momentum that I was going on my own after that. It wasn't like something I kept on referring back to, although perhaps maybe in the back of my head I was, and it was like an unconscious kind of thought. But yeah. So one of the things I loved about your paper was the Simpsons objection. And were you a big Simpsons fan? Or are you?
I did watch it some. I watched it some,
yeah.
So it's Homer Simpson's quite the character, right? So he's always saying funny, fun stuff. Yeah.
He is. Yeah, it's one of my favorite shows.
You were a big Simpsons fan, right?
Huge, massive Simpsons fan. I watch clips all the time. I spend too much time every day watching Simpsons clips. I love the show. And there are some actually good episodes that deal with faith in the show, and especially early on. But I was wondering, are there any other pieces of media that you have enjoyed, television, books, movies that speak to you, either for Pascal's wager or I guess more generally in the topics that you write about?
Great question. I mean, I think I'll say something just because it's really salient to me because I just watched this. So it's a movie called Silence. Have you heard of this? No. Okay. So yeah, like one really interesting question, and I actually don't know if philosophers have written on this, but it is related to questions I'm interested in about religious commitment. Maybe not. Actually, maybe it is kind of related to Pascal's wager. But it's like, when someone's like, just say you don't believe in God and then we won't kill you. Like these martyr type of situations. Or just in this movie, they have people, there's a little picture of Jesus and they say, just like lightly put your foot on it. Just like lightly step on it, and I find it like so interesting because some people just refuse to do it. Even though arguably you could probably still put your foot on a picture of Jesus and be a Christian, you know what I mean?
Yeah,
and they're like any kind of sign that they're not loyal to the religion, I think is really a big deal for them. Whereas maybe other people will, like, it's almost like, so in ethics, you hear about like consequentialism and deontology. I don't know if you're super familiar, but more focusing on like what are the overall consequences versus like what are the rules I should follow. And so it's a more deontological, I think, way of viewing religious commitment, where like any deviation in loyalty or from the rule that I've committed to is not worth me being tortured for months, years, whatever, and so anyway, the movie is really interesting because it's about actually persecutions that happened in Japan, which I didn't really know about, how intense and long these were, like the 16 and 1700s, I think. And then priests that went over there and just faced this really intense persecution, and then this very specific priest did sort of make the decision. He was faced with 4 people being tortured in front of him and made the decision to kind of step on Jesus. And anyway, I just watched this movie, and so that's like probably talking about it more than it's interesting. But I think it's super interesting to think about these kinds of scenarios and what the right thing to do is, and is it wrong or denying your faith just to do some kind of small action that seems in some way harmless, but to some people really seriously wrong. So, and it actually relates in some ways to Pascal's wager, right? Because you're sort of doing this cost-benefit analysis and trying to figure out what's the cost of doing this. There's obviously a big benefit of me not getting tortured, or these other people not being tortured, or whatever. And so, anyway, that's been something I've been thinking about lately, and kind of wanting to see if like anyone's written on this question of like martyrs and these people that either do or don't, do these small I don't know what you want to call them, but disloyal acts, and how you might kind of view that as a religious person. So that movie is, I mean, I will say it's like intense and there's a lot of really disturbing torture in it. So I'm not necessarily recommending it blankly, but if you're interested in that and you can handle some violence, it's a very interesting.
Oh, interesting. I'll check it out. I love, it sounds like horror adjacent, and I do like that genre generally. So I will check that out.
Yeah, there's some intense scenes of people being tortured. I mean, the stuff they did to them is awful. And I think what's so intense about it for me is that it's real. Like, it's all stuff they actually did. And so that makes it in some ways even harder to swallow, because you're like, this is like, they did this for like over 100 years, and it's just really sad. So anyway, yeah, you should check it out.
Let's check it out. Did you ever watch the show The Good Place?
Yes, I have watched The Good Place. That's a fun show. Have you watched it? I'm guessing.
I'm almost done. I just started a few weeks ago. Yeah. It was all part of this. I mean, I came across your paper a few weeks ago, and then I started watching The Good Place, and I was just like all this stuff with the afterlife and thinking about.
True, it is very related to afterlife stuff. I wasn't. Into that, but of course,
entirely, yeah.
I love it.
You're a fan of the show. You enjoy it.
Oh yeah, no, it's great. I know there's like, I think Pamela Hieronymus, she's like a great philosopher at UCLA. I think she was one of the advisors for the show. Like, I think it's really philosophically well done. I should go back. I watched like quite a bit of it. Like, I want to say, how many seasons is there? There's
four seasons. Yeah.
So I think I watched at least 2 of the seasons, but I should go back and actually like finish it, because I really enjoyed it, and then just kind of got off track, and now I've just been watching like trash TV, so I should actually go back and I watched too much like Love Is Blind crap. So
interesting. Yeah.
No, it's not. I'm not proud of it, but I guess my excuse is I like do all this deep thinking all day, and I just sometimes need.
Yeah, you have to decompress.
Compressing show. So anyway, but yeah, I should go back and finish it. So you're almost done. I'm
almost done. Yeah, halfway through the last season. But I can understand. I sort of can understand watching like 2 seasons and then taking a break, because the show ends up getting. Well, I don't want to spoil it for anybody that hasn't seen it, but
it takes a turn, right?
And then there starts to, like, every episode, there starts to be like a lot of rules and like new situations, and I feel like you can't really stay moored. Sort of, it's like, well, here's this crazy thing from out of nowhere. It's like, okay, well, I just got used to the situation like an episode or 2 ago, and now you're changing it up. But it is very good. It is still excellent, and I recommend it to anybody. It's a fun show. Very funny. And I wanted to ask you too about your non-philosophical interests. Yeah, we share some. I'm a huge basketball fan.
I love it. That's awesome.
Massive.
Do you have any teams you follow, or like players?
Yeah, I'm from Massachusetts, so the Celtics are my team. I kind of like the whole league in general. I also play a lot, so I enjoy it. Yeah, recreationally. Yeah.
How about you? Like pick up at a gym, or you play like in leagues, or
pick up on the mean streets of New York City is where
I love it.
Regular guys. I love it. I love it so much.
If we're ever in the same town, we'll have to play some pickup basketball. I'm always looking for people to play with. So
cool. Yeah. I think I watched a lecture you gave at a conference, and you said that there was some pickup basketball. There was some basketball game as a part of it. I was like, I want to be there. I want to be at that conference.
For a while, there was like a group of us, and we were all trying to like go to the same conferences to like play in basketball games like around the sessions or something. So it was really fun. I played basketball ever since, forever, like elementary school basically. And it's just I love it. I also love, it's like such a fun way to work out. It's also a great way to meet people. And in grad school, like before I had kids and when I was like a little more free, we would just go and play for like 4 hours at a time. Like it was ridiculous. Like, I laugh because I had so much extra free time back then. I could not do that today. Also, I don't know if my body can handle that anymore. I'm 34. I'm like, I could play like 2-3 days a week now. I can't go play like 4 hours a day, 6 days a week. You know what I mean? So anyway, but I still love it. It's freezing out here right now, but we have a hoop in our driveway that we like to play.
Awesome.
Getting my 2-year-old into it too. So hopefully he continues with that interest.
Train the young one. Do you have a certain game? Do you model your basketball game after a certain player, or like do you have a certain style?
So I definitely like posting up and doing the post player thing, but then I also kind of like to take the like outside jumper that's not quite a 3, you know what I mean? Like a 15-foot jump shot, kind of keep people on their toes. So I don't know. I guess that's kind of just how my game evolved to, I do the post moves and all that stuff, but then I like to kind of do that outside jumper, which I feel like is like a lot less common now, which does kind of make sense, right? Like if you're going to do that outside jumper, you might as well just take the 3, but never been a big 3-point shooter. So I don't know. What about you?
Same here. Yeah, it's funny. Yeah, someone who's we're thinking about math a lot. It's like analytics out there. I do sometimes think of, it's a consideration, but I'm a terrible 3-point shooter. Yeah. But I wish it's like a part of my game I've been trying to add, but I'm just not, I just can't put it together.
You have to shoot, you have to practice a lot to really get it. And I've just never had the
You do.
discipline, I guess. I don't know.
Yeah.
You're like a post player?
I'm like,
Or
I wish I could be more. I'm more of like a four, like
a
power
four. Okay.
forward, like a
Yeah.
Tim. Like I get called like the fundamental out there a lot because because I'm not like Tim Duncan. Obviously, he's one of the best players ever. But I specialize in the bank shots. So
Yeah.
basically, every shot I take is a banker.
That's
So
great
I
though.
have to like get to certain parts of the court where that's an optimal shot. And it's basically
Yeah,
like a
yeah, yeah.
45-degree shot.
Uh-huh. Or the like right in front. Sometimes that one
Y-
you can do reliable. I don't
Yeah.
know, but yeah.
Yeah. There's a certain
Yeah.
like relationship I have with the backboard now. It's sort of like
But
the touch and feel. Yeah.
people like you, if you like when you get that down, actually think the probability it goes in can be like a lot higher than like, the person who's just swishing everything. So
That's
that's
why I
great. Yeah.
started. That's why I developed a shot because I saw there's research paper. I do like research papers. I do
Oh,
like
you look
reading
at research.
research.
I love that.
There's an academic paper I can send it to you if you're interested, where they looked
Yes.
at the angle of the ball. If you're it's like a 45-degree shot and you're like more than 8 feet away, I think there's like a sweet spot there where aiming for the backboard is better than for just the rim.
Oh, so cool.
Yeah, and that's why Tim Duncan, that was
That's
his
why,
go-to
yeah.
shot for so many years, and that's something that's kind of not even in the league anymore. They even teach kids that growing up, like they don't teach
Wow.
any bankers anymore. But there's like a certain sweet spot on the court where
There's a space for it, yeah.
there's a space for it. Yeah,
Yeah, and that's cool too, because then you're kind of you have a unique thing that other people aren't
exactly.
doing.
It's an
So I love
identity.
it. I
Yeah,
love it.
right.
I
It's
love
like otherwise I'm nothing, but with that I have like an identity, and that's like so fun to have. And then the other thing, also part of your non-philosophical interest, I just got into this a few months ago with like pour overs, but you said you love coffee.
it.
Is there a certain bean or a certain what's
I'm
your go-to?
Yeah, I'm not as intense as some people. Like I have friends that like roast their own coffee and but like I'll do like the French press, the AeroPress, get me some good local beans, like that kind of stuff. So, and I've been getting into like espresso more, but not like the really expensive fancy kinds, but I've been enjoying some espresso recently as well. So, yeah, what about you? Have you you do like a pour over or anything?
I do like a pour. I got like a Kalita Wave, which is like
Okay.
it's like one of the recommended pour overs contraptions. And
Yeah.
I've just been really basic, simple bean, but grinding, of course, and
Yep.
started getting into that habit and that routine, and it's something I'm really enjoying, and like I want to get into a little bit more and kind of
Yeah.
figure out what the better beans are and dive into that.
Yeah,
So
that's great. That's great. My most recent hobby, slightly different but related, is making my own ice cream. I don't know if you've ever heard of
ooh,
the Ninja Creamy or if you like ice cream,
no, I
but
do.
it is amazing. And the reason I thought of it actually is because this morning I had coffee ice cream as my
Oh,
coffee, which sounds ridiculous, but the homemade version I make, it's like there's no sugar, it's super high in protein, and it's like it tastes just like normal ice cream. So anyway, that's been my new obsession. I should like add to my non-philosophical interests is like
ooh,
Ninja Creamy ice cream making because
wow.
it's
It
been kind
tastes
of an obsession.
it tastes like ice cream, but no sugar.
Yeah, so it's like basically I'm making a protein shake. And
Okay.
sometimes I'll add like liquid stevia or, like protein powder has like some sweetener in it, and then, I'll do like cottage cheese and sometimes I'll do other flavors or whatever, vanilla, different things. And then you just freeze it. And then the Ninja Creamy turns it into like a soft serve, which is great. And so then I'll add like Quest makes these like high protein like Reese's cups that like have very little sugar, so I'll do like a Reese's ice cream. You know what I mean? But it's just like it's great because I can eat ice cream every day like guilt free. So
Oh, cool. That's awesome. I
yeah,
want to do that.
no, I know. It's like that's why I'm currently obsessed. Because this is just like how I drink my protein shakes now. So
Wow, that is next level thinking. That's awesome. Yeah.
Not sponsored.
Yeah, not sponsored. None of the things I mentioned were sponsored either. This is so funny. I don't really actually end up doing this at the end of podcasts where I end up like connecting and asking everyday life things because it's fun. It's cool to get a inside look a little bit.
I love that you love basketball. Then I feel like that's.
Oh yeah, I do.
You'll run into the people that want to talk philosophy and then also are like into basketball every day. I feel like the sports people and the philosophy people are like
they tend to
not
be
overlapping circles. So anyway, it's always fun to meet fellow sports fans that are
Absolutely. I have a few. Back the years ago, I made some basketball content for my YouTube channel. Like nobody watched it. I got like,
I'm gonna go watch it.
oh, you should watch. Yeah, I had one more view to some of those videos, but yeah, it's funny because yeah, I thought, well, it's stuff I like, but you know, the people are interested in watching this stuff. They're into like metaphysics and into the big philosophical thing, not like sports necessarily. But well, this is really
There's like a whole area of philosophy of sports actually, which I would love to like learn more about. I'm not really an expert on, but really cool, interesting, tons of different topics that come up there. So anyway, I don't know, that could be a way to connect them, but yeah, that's cool.
Yeah. And one thing too, I should have cut off the fun part stuff because you know you got to go in a minute. But one of the papers I did want to highlight that we didn't get a chance to talk about, but is your Faith is Weakly Positive?
Oh, that paper it just came out. Yeah.
Which just came out, and maybe you know I'll link in the description. I should have said this at the top, but your papers and in this one included. But if you would mind, like maybe giving a teaser for the audience, and this could be sort of the way we end the discussion.
Yeah, I would love to. So, huge question: what is faith, and how is it different than belief? And I think a lot of people sort of when you kind of like faith and belief seem kind of similar, it's like, yeah, I have faith, I believe, I don't know. So here's one big difference that I think philosophers have noticed. When we believe things, it doesn't really, like, we can believe things we want to be true. We can believe things we don't want to be true. Like, I believe it's freaking freezing outside, but I don't want that to be true. But, I believe I'm warm inside and I do want that to be true, right? So our beliefs kind of come apart from our desires. But when we have faith that something's true, it's weird to say you have faith in something when you really don't want it to be true, right? So I would never have faith that there was a global pandemic. I would never have faith that my friend had cancer, or my friend would never stop smoking, or, these things that are obviously bad, right? And so, so this difference between faith and belief, I think, is interesting and important. Faith kind of goes along with desire in a way that belief doesn't. And then in the paper, what I'm trying to do is, I guess, two things. One, argue for this genuine distinction against some people who have tried to say this is not the way to distinguish faith and belief. So yes, no, I do think faith always involves desire in a way that belief doesn't. But two, say it doesn't have to just be a desire. It can be viewing the object positively in a lot of different ways. It could even be a desire to desire the object of faith. And so in a way, I'm making faith possible in a larger number of situations, but still saying faith is always going to involve some kind of positive attitude. So that's what I mean by weakly positive. It involves positivity, but it can be weaker than like a full-blown desire.
Gotcha. Cool. Awesome.
Yeah.
Thank you for that summary. Yeah, I'll link in that description. Yeah, whatever.
Faith debate stuff, but hopefully enough that at least some of your listeners will find it interesting.
But fascinating stuff. Yeah. And well, awesome. This was such a fun conversation. Got so much out of this. Thank you, Liz. I really appreciate your time. And I'm excited to see what comes up in the future with your papers. I'll keep following your work.
Yeah. Well, thanks so much again for having me and for all your awesome questions. And I'm serious about us playing pickup someday. So
let's do it. Yeah. That'd be so fun. You're always welcome in New York too. Okay.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
All right. Well,
Thanks,
have a good one.
You too. Bye.